Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for coming to today's episode of The Latest. I want to start out by saying that I am sorry that we're getting started a little bit late today. I was having some technical issues with Instagram, which actually I was not able to get resolved, so we won't have the show up on Instagram. When we take a break to bring our guest on, I'm going to try again and see if I can get our Instagram friends up and running, but if not, we'll just be on Facebook, YouTube, Twitch, and Twitter. So for those of you that are logging in or viewing from any of those platforms, thank you so much for joining us. This is the most recent episode of The Latest. The Latest is a new show that Matter is bringing to you all to try to give you more regular updates on the news that are related to the two investigations that we cover, which for those of you who may not be as familiar, those two investigations are policing and development. We titled both of those Crossing the Line and Develop Us, respectively. So the show is meant to give you a little bit more insight and a little bit more information on stuff that we're coming up with and that we're discovering in the process of reporting on those two issues that may not make it into some of the final pieces that we put out that are our bigger, kind of heftier pieces, but are still like valuable bits of information that help inform how we see these issues, and we think we'll do the same for you. So the first half of the show will be focused on a quick digest of the latest headlines in policing and development. And then the second half of the show will feature a live interview with a guest that has knowledge or expertise within those two investigative areas. Today's guest will be Stephen David from the Columbus Safety Collective, and he'll be talking to us about non-police emergency response. So that's like instances when social workers and other folks who are non-police come to respond to 911 calls, especially around like mental health and things like that, mental health crises and things like that. So with that, I think that we will get started. So for today, we're going to start out with some DU stories. We've got 3 stories for both issues today. Let me get that up and loaded. All right, so our first story today is, Our first story today is about a camp on the south side of unhoused folks. Those folks are actually facing eviction. Those folks are facing eviction coming this next Tuesday. So that's June 14th. The city announced a little while ago that they would be coming to clear the site, which if you've followed Matter, you've seen some of our coverage on sweeps of unhoused camps before. That's a collaborative effort between the Department of Development, specifically code enforcement, and the Columbus Division of Police. They announced that the folks that were there were considered trespassing and would be there to remove them with threat of arrest if they are not removed. That camp is one of the biggest camps in the city, and have a lot of folks who have been there for quite some time. And so as a result, several folks have organized to push back against the city's removal of those residents. Specifically a group called Here to Serve. The camp is at Here Park, and Here to Serve, HEER, has been a group of folks who are helping to kind of help facilitate things in the camp and are organizing efforts around actions on June 14th to protest the city's actions, or to protest the city's removal of these residents. I think that's most of it for that story. The group also mentions that part of the reason that many of these adults are in this camp is because of a lack of affordability in Columbus, which, as I mentioned, if you follow Matter, you've seen us reporting on that as well. For those folks who are interested in getting more involved, the Here to Serve folks are specifically calling for an action at 8:30 a.m. At Here Park on June 14th, which is this following Tuesday. We will also be out there covering it. Folks at Matter will be out there covering the event, including any interactions with the police and things like that. Our hope is to go live and to be live streaming on Instagram, so we'll see if we get this issue fixed by then. And at very least be taking photos and videos and things like that so that we can share with you what's happening at this park, and to be able to give more eyes to what it looks like when these kinds of sweeps happen here in Columbus. So look out for more coverage on that or updates on that. And that's our first story for today. Our second story for today, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but usually I'll go through 3 DU stories. As you saw in the slide that I put up earlier, I'll mention all 3 of those and then kind of highlight them as we go through, and then I'll go over into CTL stories. Typically for this show, I'll switch between starting with development and policing, and we'll have 3 to 5 stories per show. Our next story today, Franklin County actually opposed a tax deal that OBETS was working with a developer to help that developer to pay less taxes as part of the tax incremental finance deal. So basically, the county ended up opposing this measure because they felt like the lack of income from the taxes that would be coming in as part of this deal would hurt the social services in OBETS. But OBETS itself, the city of OBETS, actually came up with 2 different TIF deals with a developer to help develop to help build residential developments in properties, some of which the city owns. One of those developments would be about 420 new units, that would be single-family homes. And then there is another, my notes on this are not very clear. And then there's another 250 new single-family homes that were part of the second deal with OBETS. Franklin County, as I said, opposed the measure, saying that doing so, allowing these deals to go through, would take away from tax revenue for county social services that provide services to a lot of the agents, or to a lot of the residents that live there. Even though they're part of the city of OBETS, they're also part of the Franklin County and receive services that way. So essentially, it was OBETS saying, we want to incentivize development. Here's a deal for us to incentivize these 2 developments. And then the county was like, wait, hold on a second. We want to be able to make sure that we're still getting some of that revenue that you're making the deal, saying we're not going to take any revenue from these developments. So they put in a measure to oppose that. Coming up, I believe on the 13th, there will be another decision, I believe, from OBETS that'll decide whether or not they'll be able to go forward with that. And our third and final story for DU today is more incentives for Intel. So for those of you who don't know, Intel actually is going to be, Intel, the technology company, is going to be creating a development in New Albany that has already received a good amount of incentives from New Albany, as well as I believe already from the state. And now they've received even more incentives in order to build in New Albany, which I believe they've already agreed to. And so this report is from Ohio Capital Journal, where they mentioned that Policy Matters Ohio had recently uncovered that Intel is going to get hundreds of millions more in incentives from the state, under the guise that the Intel project will be a boon to the economy and will incentivize further development and growth, especially like workforce development, which we've heard in the past as well. Excuse me. Some of those tax breaks, it's worth noting, would also cost funding sources similar to the last story I just mentioned, would cost some funding and some sources of revenue for local governments and libraries, which is usually part of the case when tax breaks are given, but with the amount of these tax breaks, that could be a sizable amount of revenue. Part of the argument that Policy Matters Ohio has made in uncovering these extra incentives is that the incentivization of development in this area would be beneficial and could be beneficial, but there needs to be certain protections in place for taxpayers in case Intel doesn't actually have the return on investment that they're proposing to do or to have in order to qualify for these tax breaks. Many of the incentives now are before the legislator and are part of Ohio's $3.5 billion capital projects budget. According to a note from the Ohio Legislative Service Commission, some of these incentives include an exemption on commercial activity tax for the sale of capital equipment that costs at least $100 million per item. So essentially, for any equipment, capital equipment specifically, that they sell, they'll be able to avoid paying the taxes on those materials. Sales tax exemption for any equipment primarily used for research and development. Sales tax exemption, I'm sure we all know what that means. And then there's 2 other sales tax exemptions for construction materials, as well as for any materials used in the manufacturing process. For the specific like mega project that they've labeled, which I believe is the creation of a new chip. And then also job creation tax credits to Intel and its suppliers for up to 30 years. So as a clarification, tax credits versus tax breaks. Tax breaks usually means that they don't have to pay up front, that they will be able to get a discount on that portion of taxes that they would normally owe. And a tax credit means that you pay those taxes, but then you'll get reimbursed some based on meeting certain requirements. So for this one, it would be some drop requirements. So I think that is most of our news for today in development. And now we'll switch to our policing stories. All right, so for our first story for policing, is a bit of unfortunate news. There was another shooting and killing of a resident in Franklin County. This specific instance was a Franklin County Sheriff's deputy who shot and killed a 20-year-old who was suspected of a double homicide a few weeks before, I believe it was a few weeks before. 20-year-old was Paz Striblin. He was shot and killed by a Franklin County Sheriff's deputy Tuesday night at a Sunoco gas station in northeast Columbus. There was a press conference from the sheriff's office following that. So sorry, I'm having a hard time with my page loading. Okay, here we go. So like I said, Paz Striblin was shot and killed by a Franklin County Sheriff's deputy Tuesday night. They had a press conference following where they clarified certain aspects of why the officers were there. Chief Deputy Rick Minard said officers were looking for Striblin because he was a registered sex offender and had failed to update his information, which is a requirement of being on that registry. They also said he was a suspect of a double homicide that happened at the end of May. An important note here is that I don't even think they actually said that he was a suspect. He was a person of interest in that, but I don't believe any charges had actually been filed yet. He did note that the officers were in plain clothes, but he said that they were identifiable by bullet vest badges and the word sheriff on them. Not sure exactly what that means for how they were presented, but the argument from Minard is that they were identifiable as police officers, as sheriff's deputies. Despite the sheriff's office having recently invested in body cameras, they were not implemented before this incident, which means there won't be body camera footage of this specific incident. Minard also said that Striblin was a minor when he was convicted as a sex offender, so his record is not publicly available, which means that for us as a news organization, we can't go through and verify that he was on the registry. But that we do have from Minard that's the reason that they were going out and were looking for Striblin in the first place. As a note on the body cameras, and we'll get into this a little bit more in a later story, but it's been a point of contention for a lot of folks whether or not officers have body cameras specifically for Franklin County Sheriff's Office, because a few years ago one of the sheriff's deputies shot and killed Casey Goodson Jr. And did not have any body camera footage for us to review when that happened, and so there were a lot of calls and a lot of shock that the sheriff's office did not have body cameras prior to that, and as a response to that they've worked on getting body cameras now but have not yet implemented them. All right, for our second story, and for those of you who follow Matter, you might have even seen this story on our website, but City Council, Columbus City Council recently passed police reforms. This happened earlier this week on Monday. There's a couple pieces of legislation, both up and both were up for a vote on Monday. Both were voted and approved, I believe, unanimously. The two reforms were spurred by the 2020 protests. One of them focused on the two reforms, for the numbers, for those of you who might be a little more wonky and want this detail. Those two ordinances are 1440, 2022, and then 1455, 2022. The first one was sponsored by President pro tempore Elizabeth Brown. Second one was sponsored by Councilmember Rob Dorans. The first one, 1440, basically codifies the injunction that Judge Marbley made during the lawsuit that some of you might be familiar, where several residents from Columbus sued the city because of the treatment from the police during the protests. As a refresher, that lawsuit is Alsada v. Columbus. And so in that lawsuit, the judge ordered an injunction basically prohibiting Columbus police officers from using certain non-lethal tactics against nonviolent protesters, specifically tear gas, pepper spray, rubber bullets, wooden pellets, and similar actions against nonviolent protesters. So this ordinance that Councilmember Brown sponsored basically codifies that injunction and means that going forward, that'll be a regular part of the rules prohibiting CPD's behavior in that kind of a way with nonviolent protesters in terms of kind of crowd control measures. So that was the first issue. And as a note, for those of you who aren't familiar, there was a settlement that was reached as part of that lawsuit. And the city agreed to the injunction and then codified that, and made a payment of $5.75 million to the plaintiffs. The second ordinance that was passed is a measure that was also as a result of the 2020 protests. This specific ordinance made it mandatory that officers could be identifiable at all times. It made it mandatory that they wear their badge numbers and names on alternative uniforms, and ensure that they are identifiable that they are identifiable at all times while on duty. This is also, like I said, part of as a result of the 2020 protests. In the process of that lawsuit and the city's investigation into wrongdoing from the police against residents of Columbus, there was a lot of difficulties in determining who the officers were that were responsible, especially from a lot of the footage that was taken, because there was no badge number or name on a lot of the uniforms, and so trying to identify the officers and make sure that accountability was maintained was, according to the city, much more difficult. And so as a result, they passed this ordinance to make it a requirement that on riot gear, as well as like other uniforms that CPD will be in, that they will be able to be identified at all times. And last, but certainly not least, our last story for CTL for today is about body cams. So I mentioned that we'd be coming back to this a little bit. As I mentioned before, body cams have been a push from several members of the community as well as outside experts for a push for more accountability from the police here in Columbus. Both Franklin County Sheriff's Office and Columbus Division of Police have recently announced that they have chosen the type of body cameras that they will be able to use and will be implementing them soon. Similar features exist within both of those cameras. So a couple of those that I kind of want to walk through. So before this new wave of body cameras being implemented, the only cameras that existed were for the Columbus Division of Police. And those cameras were fairly limited for a number of reasons. If you want more insight on that, we have an explainer on our website that goes into kind of what CBD's policy is with body cameras and what the ways and the functionalities they had before were before this new set of cameras. One of those includes a look back feature that is only up to a minute, and I believe also does not have any audio. These new cameras will actually feature a longer look back feature, or a longer look back time with audio, which is important in instances where there is police wrongdoing or even especially police killing, where you can look back at the time before the incident happened to kind of see what led up to that, in order for folks to be able to determine whether or not the officer was justified in their actions according to the protocols that are laid out for police officers and for the sheriff's office. And so that look back feature allows us to kind of get more context before the incident. For CPD's new cameras, they'll allow 2 minutes for that look back feature. For Franklin County Sheriff's Office, they'll have 5 minutes for that look back feature. CPD is going to start testing and implementing those cameras in May, and Franklin County Sheriff's Office expects to begin testing in July and then have it fully rolled out by October. As I mentioned before, the push for body cameras was spurred on by the deaths of Casey Goodson Jr. and Andre Hill, which happened a couple years ago in the winter for both of those cases. Andre Hill's case was a good example of where body camera footage actually can reveal more about what the incident was, and was one of those instances where the look back feature was utilized, but again, it was only 1 minute without audio, so it was still a bit more limited than what a lot of folks would like to see. So that is what we have for the headlines for today. I am going to take a quick break and get loaded up with our guest, and then we will be right back with you. Thank you so much, and we'll be back in a minute.
I just did like the test my speakers and microphone, and like that all seems good for me. But I still can't, yeah, I can't hear anything from you right now, which is fun. you say something one more time just so I can see if I've got anything from you coming through? Oh, wait, there it is. Yep, we're good.
All right, folks, and we are back. Thank you so much for your patience as I'm figuring out some tech issues. I was realizing that the audio for our guest was coming through while we were kind of setting up, so I appreciate that feedback and also appreciate your patience as I'm kind of ironing out some of the kinks here, which also goes for you, Stephen. Thank you so much for your patience as we're getting set up here.
No problem.
Awesome. So I will actually end up letting Stephen do a bit of an introduction for himself. So without further ado, here's our guest for today, Stephen David with the Columbus Safety Collective. I always want to say coalition, but it's collective. Awesome. David, Stephen, why don't you give me a little bit of an introduction to yourself? How is that?
Perfect. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate you letting me know. Um, so you were mentioning that part of the plan is to well, I guess before we get into the specific plans, I think what would be helpful for our audience to understand is kind of what non-police emergency response is, right? Like, this is one of those things that I think gets talked about a lot, but the nitty-gritty of what it actually looks like in practice can get lost sometimes. So from your perspective, how would you define non-police emergency response, and kind of what is the scale and scope of that?
Yeah, excellent. So when we talk about non-police emergency response, we're talking about having a team dispatched
Oh my gosh, there's too many buttons. There's too many things for me to keep track of. But yeah, so I think that gives us a really thorough understanding and helps to kind of differentiate between the different programs and what kind of already exists versus what you all are calling for. It sounds like a critical part of what you're talking about is making sure, and the critical difference between the programs that the city's had in the past is making sure that these are teams that are absent of law enforcement, that are like completely removed from law enforcement. Can you talk a little bit about why you view that as a critical part of it, and why that's important to your guys' specific mission to build a non-police emergency response that has no law enforcement involved? I promise I will get the hang of this. Yeah, I really appreciate that feedback, and we follow the work of Disability Rights Ohio decently closely, so I really appreciate you mentioning that as well, because there's a lot of vulnerable populations that are at risk here, right? I think that the racial discrimination and like differentiation in police treatment is something that we often talk about, but there's a lot of vulnerable groups that get affected by this, right? Um, so I wanted to bring up a program that I know that the city ran a little while ago after there was more calls for non-police emergency response, and I want a little bit of clarification if you remembered specifically, because it was a program they ran I think like a year or so ago, and it's been one of the things they've touted as like success for like expanding this kind of response. But if I'm not mistaken, I believe there was still law enforcement involved. And I was just curious if you knew much about what that program looked like and kind of how that aligned with what Columbus Safety Collective's vision of this kind of program would be.
Yeah, again,
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I want to, before I get too much into the collective's goals specifically, I wanted to get a little bit more about your personal background. I think if I understand correctly, that you do have a background in social work, but tell me a little bit more about what that background looks like and how that kind of led you to this place that you're at now.
Yeah, for sure. So
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I think I'm having a bit of an issue with your audio. Can you do a quick test for me?
yeah, can you hear me still? No.
Looks good on my end. Let me check real quick. Yes, you can, Max. Okay, I think that we are all good now. Appreciate your patience on that. Yeah, and appreciate your background too. That's really helpful to get us to kind of understand what your perspective coming into this is. One of the other things I wanted to talk to you about with the collective specifically, and you kind of alluded to this earlier, is that one of the goals is to have let me make sure I'm understanding this correctly. One of the goals is to have it included in the budget by 2023, and I believe it was to start a public advocacy campaign by 2022, which obviously is where we're at right now. I was wondering what the progress has looked like to kind of move toward those goals, how the advocacy campaign is going, if you've been finding traction, and like what kind of responses the collective has been getting from that, and then also how movement toward getting that into the budget for 2023 is looking right now.
Yeah, for sure. So we have there's been support for this issue, like in Columbus City Council, like notably, Council President Hardin has been a vocal advocate for having non-police emergency response here in the city. There and the fact that there is this existing constellation of programs like shows that there is like interest in this. Something that like we want to continue to point to though is when Columbus City Council had a hearing about the alternative response infrastructure they have in place earlier this year in January or February. Our collective testified like for this specific point about like, yes, like some of these programs are good and good things to exist. Like the follow-up that Spark does for people like connecting older adults with like services that they don't already have, like that's a good program. Like having better dispatch is a good program, but we shouldn't accept that as like as good enough for us. And the other piece like is like you asked this question earlier about like taking this infrastructure to scale. Like we want to see like a robust pilot of this program with a with like rigorous scientific evaluation built in so we can actually know what's going on here. So you know, some of these like these small pilots with like one team or like a couple people, like we think that the city like really needs to invest here. The people of Columbus have like resoundingly asked for this, like in surveys that the city did themselves, asking for people's feedback during their reimagining public safety process in 2020 and 2021. Folks want this kind of programming. So we want to see the city fund it. We want to see it funded in a robust way. So we're having these conversations now. You know, we're we're on social media where you can find our stuff, where we're talking to folks like you all, and we're planning some public events for this summer to host a people's safety forum to have these conversations in a public way, so that we can get this narrative out there, hear what our neighbors want to see and how these programs should look, and really hope that that in the mayor's 2023 operating budget that we can see a specific line item for this funding.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that obviously we've seen from the city that there's an interest in investing in this kind of response regardless. So I think there's definitely interest there. And I think your point to like how many programs there are clearly shows not just that, but also the calls for it publicly kind of shows that there's an interest in this type of response program. And so I want to clarify a little bit. So as part of the organizing efforts that you all are doing, does that include specific policy suggestions? Because it sounds like from what you're saying, it's mostly trying to create this specific program with a board for oversight for this program. But I noticed that you also have specific policy pillars. So I'm wondering how that kind of factors in, and was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about those policy pillars, kind of what they represent and why that's important to factor into this.
Yeah, absolutely. So if folks want to read them, you can go to, we're at CBUS Safety Collective on Facebook and Instagram. So you can find the link to all of our documents there if you want to read our full pillars. But I'll walk through each of them. So we have 5 things that we think are important for what this program should look like in the city. So is non-police crisis response is the first one. So we're like, is not a co-responder model, is not a follow-up, is non-police emergency response at the time at the scene, that is anti-racist and health-centered. The second is prioritizing community workers. So anyone who wants to serve their community should be able to do this work. So just like how if you want to become a police officer or an EMT or a firefighter, we think that anyone should be able to apply for this program, have their training paid for, and get a job being able to do this work. And we think that the city should prioritize those in our communities through a process of like giving preferential hiring to people of highly affected zip codes, people who have lived experience, say they've lived with suicidal ideation or have had a mental health issue themselves. And removing barriers to that work. So making sure that people who have had contacts with the criminal legal system, who may have criminal convictions, don't face unnecessary barriers. Like we want people who have touched these systems, who know what folks in their neighborhoods are going through, to be able to do this work. So non-police crisis response, prioritizing community workers. We want the city to invest in it and to be high quality jobs. Like we want to be taking care of our workers. We want dedicated funding for it. The fourth is accountability to the community. So this is the paid advisory board that we mentioned. We want an advisory board that is sourced from our communities, from our different neighborhoods, that these folks are compensated for their work, and that they provide best practices and oversight for this program. You know, like as we scale it, as it grows bigger, like things will not go right sometimes. And so we need a process to make sure that our workers are supported in this, and that they have a structure that can help them do better next time, that we're making sure we're putting out best practices there, so that, you know, there's high quality training and that folks are actually accountable to the people who live in their communities, that there's reciprocity there. And then finally, the fifth one is high quality evaluation built in at the beginning and beyond. So we would like the city to put out a request for a proposal, to have an actual like research scientist conduct a randomized controlled trial of what's actually happening in our communities. And this, I think, is like really critical to like what the future looks like. We need to get good data on this program so that we can see what's happening and adjust our funding accordingly. Like currently, 1 out of every 3 tax dollars in our city's operating budget go to pay for police. That's not like linked to evidence, right? You know, if crime goes up, if crime goes down, CPD gets more money every single year, right? And so we want this program to be based in evidence, and to be like evaluated by an outside entity so we can know what's going on and adjust our public safety funding accordingly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I appreciate your kind of context for the budget. I think a lot of people forget that public safety is like the largest share of the budget and is usually around a third of the budget for both, but most of that ends up going to CPD. So I appreciate that extra bit of context, and it's important to keep in mind. Speaking of money, do you all have any idea or gauge of how much a program like this would cost the city? Have you developed any plans or proposals that kind of put a dollar amount or even a range on it?
That we've had previously, like we would like to see the city invest $10 million to build a robust pilot. have a pilot that's available 24/7, has evaluation built in, pays an advisory board, and has the infrastructure to then take this to scale. Like, we see models across the country that are doing this right. Like a lot of folks point to the Cahoots program in Eugene, Oregon. They answered like 21,000 calls for service last year and required police backup in 300 of those. So like we've seen like really robust versions of this, and other cities are implementing this across the country. So the STAR program in Denver recently got $1.5 million from their city government to expand what they're doing. We have Macro in Oakland. We have a program in San Francisco that is now answering half of their mental health calls. So we see that like these kind of models work. But what often happens is this kind of like, is this tinkering around the edges of our public safety infrastructure, right? Like we want to see our city like be a leader here, invest in this program, knowing that like there is need for this, and take it to scale, so that we can really make sure that like the residents of our city are getting the proper response when they need it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can't help but think while you're mentioning that how much of Columbus's identity has really become innovation, right? And I think the smart city is part of that too. And like, I think there's a lot of room for innovation outside of like advancements in technology. I think that Columbus really could be a city for innovation in programs like this as well, and looking and being a leader in kind of experimenting with different ways to solve some of these social issues that we're seeing in a lot of cities throughout the country. So I think that a lot of that gives me a lot of really good insight into non-police emergency response. I'll keep thinking on some of the things you said, and I might have some follow-up questions. But before I forget, because I tend to forget this part, if folks want to get engaged and want to get involved in this kind of advocacy work that you're doing, or just want to learn more about non-police emergency response, where would you direct them? Where could they get plugged in?
Yeah, absolutely. So find us on social. Like I said, we're on Facebook and Instagram at CBUS Safety Collective. We have a link tree at linktree / CBUS Safety Collective. So find us on social, drop us a line there. And like we're like, and so right now, like we're getting the word out there for folks. So like us, follow us, share our stuff. And then keep an eye for this summer when we launch our People's Safety Forum that we're currently planning, so we can have an opportunity for us to have these conversations in a bigger forum. I think that like this coming year is going to be like a really essential time for this. Like you mentioned like Columbus and leading with innovation. Like one thing that the city often does is that we try and like build our own version of something that exists already. And so this is actually like not a time to do that. Like this constellation of programs that we have, like I said, like most of them are good, but I don't think is a substitute for this kind of work that we're seeing in communities across the country that are moving this way. The place that we really can innovate here, though, is by launching non-police emergency response and thinking about it as broadly as possible. Like for us at the Safety Collective, like this is not about proper responses to mental health issues. It's not about proper responses to alcohol and other drugs or to homelessness issues. This is about like, what are the ways that we can reduce contact with law enforcement, with the criminal legal system? So like a huge, the most common responses that police make are to complaints, to robberies that have occurred, and then traffic violations. So and in each of these, like those require force or have force reported at least in less than 1% of cases. So there's huge chunks of like the functioning of law enforcement that we can reduce. Like I think we've all seen times where like folks get caught up in the criminal legal system because of something like a traffic stop. And so if you happen to have drugs in your car and are in an accident, like that can open up the gateway to all of these other poverty traps that is the criminal legal system. So like this for us is a larger harm reduction mechanism of reducing those law enforcement contacts. So that's, I think, the place where the city can really innovate, is by thinking broadly about this program, by taking it to scale and having it be based on evidence as we grow it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love what you said about essentially not having to reinvent the wheel, right? Like there's programs already existing here that we can pull from and can use as examples. One of the things I was thinking about earlier that I wanted to follow back up on was this kind of question of money and financing. And so you mentioned that you want to see $10 million in the budget kind of being specifically earmarked for this. Have you seen in any of the examples that you've studied of other cities that you mentioned, like San Francisco and other, you mentioned a couple other of those that I'm missing in this, But have you seen any like balancing or what those numbers end up shaking out to be? Because I can't help but wonder if there was this investment in non-police emergency response, if that would limit the responsibilities for police and potentially mean that there could be less budget in that realm of the budget and be less funds kind of dedicated there. But I don't know if it would actually balance out that way. So I was curious if you had seen from any of the other examples that you mentioned what the kind of numbers shake out to be.
So I honestly don't like have that number as far as like anyone that's done like a cost analysis in terms of like the savings to the city or anything like that. So like I don't have good figures on that. To me, like is a piece for, again, like this need of like robust scientific evaluation. And that like, and you know, like there are folks who can do this kind of work, and like we let like the actual research scientists go and do this. So, you know, collect good data at the front end, make it publicly accessible, put out a request for a proposal to grant fund someone to actually evaluate this project. Like those are things that we should know, you know, like we should be able to know like what certain interventions cost versus other ones. You know, I think like there's a lot of data out there about like what the effects are of like people like once they enter the criminal legal system. So like those are like the lost productivity, like the challenge to our communities, like all those kind of detriments of like once you are pulled into the criminal legal system, like that's something we want to avoid. But like we can use this process as a way to like actually get at that number you're talking about of like what does it cost to have police respond to some of these kind of these same things versus what does it cost for us to do it with a trained group of a crisis intervention specialist and emergency medical technician, and what are the actual outcomes that we're getting at.
Yeah, absolutely. At least for my part, I'm always excited to see data and see the numbers that back it up and back up the claims. So I could not agree more. I think that's most of the questions that I have for you. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that we didn't touch on that you would like to be able to mention, slash like anything else that you want to plug? I know we already were talking about your socials and things like that, but just want to give you a space to touch on anything we missed.
No, yeah, I really appreciate you all continuing to hold this space and continue to like to lift up the need for this issue. Again, folks can find us at C-Bus Safety Collective, and we hope that you continue to watch our stuff so that when we launch our public events later this summer, you have an opportunity to meet us and plug into the work.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always a big fan of chances to actually get folks together in the same space, which feels like a rarity these days. So I will take the advantages and take the opportunities when they come. Awesome. Thank you so much, Stephen. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you being on the show, and we'll keep following up with you. For all the folks in the audience, you'll be able to get all of David's responses in a Q&A on our website, and we'll be publishing that here shortly. So thank you so much, David.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jalen. Appreciate your time.
Have a good one.
Bye.
Alrighty, folks. And that is all that I have for you today. So thank you all so much for joining us, joining me and joining Steve and David from the Columbus Safety Collective. There was a bit of a rough start today, so I really appreciate everyone's patience as we're kind of ironing this out. I think I've mentioned this in past shows, but to pull back the curtain a little bit, I am the only person running all of this to get the live stream up and running, as well as making sure that I actually know what I'm talking about while I'm up here. So it's a fairly big task that we're figuring out and piecing together bit by bit. So we really appreciate your guys' patience in kind of allowing for some hiccups here and there, and definitely appreciate any feedback you can give us about what you think works, what doesn't work, and any issues we might have that we didn't mention that we're aware of. So as always, really appreciate it. Thank you all so much for tuning in. And as I mentioned, we'll be posting several pieces of the content from this show on our website, as well as sharing it out on our email list. So check in at matternews.org for those posts online, or sign up for our email list at matternews.org/newsletter. Thank you all so much, and I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend. Have a good one.